Hello everybody, Jake your resident content cowboy here. Yeehaw, it's Monday. On Mondays we do tier lists, and on Wednesdays we wear pink.
Corporate needs you to find the differences between this picture and this picture. Intel has told us there are at least 7.
Okay, I already see one. Give him. Okay.
They're the same picture.
Today's tier list is going to be based on the newest set released in Pokémon Pocket, Mythical Island. Now, of course, with any new set, things are always in flux, so a lot of what looks like the meta this week might start to shift as players start to adjust to it. And of course, I think in Pocket, you really should be playing all the decks you want to play. There is no punishment for losing in your matches. So if there's a deck you want to play and you're trying to figure it out, I would highly recommend playing that over something that someone says is really, really good, or it's great just because it won some tournaments and stuff like that. Play what you like. Unless what you like is Mewtwo, then change. So a couple things. First, I've got it set up here to where we can take a look at some of the cards I'm talking about in a little more detail. If there's something specific I want to mention as to why I think this card is doing great or why it's not doing so great. We have our tiers for the week. We have our God tier. We're only going to put one Pokemon card in our God tier. We're not friggin' Norse around here. We have our S tier, the super strong tier. These are Pokemon and decks that I think are shaping the meta and outperforming. We have the A tier. These are solid decks that I think are doing pretty dang well, and you see a ton of them. We have the B tier. Still got the B tier. These decks are relevant decks. They're not really overperforming. Maybe some of them are underperforming a little bit, but they're really, really relevant in the meta. We have our C tier. These are like, these decks could work, but you don't see them very much. We have our D tier, the don't even think about it tier. I don't think I'm going to put too much there because I really think in general, I would love for people to be thinking about it. Like, come up with lots of cool different decks. I love seeing people's different brews. And then we have our MIA tier. This tier is named after the singer MIA. No, these are decks that are just kind of missing, and I haven't seen them much at all. We haven't seen them much in tournaments, so that is what we're looking at here. Now, on this list, I have every Pokemon card essentially in the game, but we're not going to go through every Pokemon card. I'm going to go through a lot of the new additions in Mythical Island and a lot of the relevant meta cards, right? That is what we're going to be focusing on in this video. As always, I would love to hear from you in the comments. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Be cool to each other, but I love the discussion. Let's get into it. So I think it would be reasonable to either wait to the end or to start with something like Celebi EX. Celebi is a really interesting card, and I'm sure right when it dropped, a lot of you thought the same thing, which is this card is insane. And when this card is working, holy, you are flipping so many coins and devastating your opponents. However, when this card is not working, holy, you are flipping so many coins and devastating yourself. The question is, where do you really put a card like this? I think in tournaments, it's interesting because Celebi being sort of unreliable at times does make it a bit of a spoiler card and a bit of a spoiler deck. On any given day, basically, it could beat any deck, but it could also lose to any deck. So I think because of that, it hasn't been insanely relevant in tournaments, having kind of like a moderately low win rate compared to some of the other stuff in the meta. I think Celebi is a super relevant card, which is why I'm putting it here in our B tier. I also don't think we've really cracked the code on what's going on maybe with a good Celebi deck. In fact, I actually think, well, let's talk about it. I want to bring up Superior right here as well. So I think Celebi is a really interesting card, but I think Superior is really the card in that set. Like, the grass card to be talking about is Superior. Let me find it here. Superior could make a lot of decks really relevant, and I do think maybe the thing is Celebi on its face looks like the deck, but it is actually not going to be what you want to end up playing here. Oh, of course, they have it sorted in that annoying way where it's like cut partway through. There's Superior. We'll just use this one. So this card I think is really great. It's extremely strong. This is Superior. That's the full art right there. Jungle Totem's ability, allowing grass energy to provide 2 grass energy, is really crazy good. It's really powerful when combined with Celebi, but I also think like there are some sneaky good combinations with it. I think Executor decks, especially the new Executor, I think is actually really solid with Superior. To me, this is more of a star for the grass cards than Celebi. I think while we're here talking about grass decks, let's talk about some of the big ones in the game. I want to talk about Venusaur. Venusaur, in my opinion, like once we saw what happened with Celebi, Superior, Executor, and stuff like that, I feel like Venusaur has been completely missing in action, and I'm curious to see what happens if we start bringing it back in. The thing about Venu is like a really powerful card, but it takes a lot of setup. I do think Superior could help with that, but at the same time, now you have 2 stage 2s in your deck. I don't know if Venusaur is going to find a new place in the meta anytime soon. It is interesting because it could play well into things like Golem, New Golem, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, but Venusaur just feels like it is kind of missing in action. A Pokemon that I do think is still really good is Executor. I don't see an insane amount of it, but this is just a great card. It's 1 energy, a lot of HP, solid damage. It's really powerful, and I think it pairs well with Superior. Not necessarily because of the energy requirement for attacking, but because of the energy requirement for retreating. And when you have a card that only needs 1 energy, that's a great tank that you can build up this front line with, you can then spend the rest of your time looking for something else in your deck to power up. You could pair it with Celebi. You could pair it with New Executor, which let me go ahead and pull that up to our tier list here as well. I think New Executor is really solid. I think this is a really, really good card. Let me find it here for everybody. New Executor is like the grass version of Alakazam. I think New Executor is actually pretty solid here, and I'm not sure exactly where it will end up here. It's possible that I'll have to move it down here to the B tier, just a relevant card, but I do think people might be sleeping a little bit on this. I think it's really strong, especially paired with Superior, and maybe what we were looking for with Celebi is actually more what you get out of an Executor and an Executor EX deck with this Pokemon. But there are a few of the grass Pokemon in this meta right now. I do think Venusaur is just like mysteriously absent, and I think Celebi is in individual games insane, but overall clearly it is not the best card in the game. The next new card I want to talk about, let's talk about Aerodactyl EX here. Aerodactyl is a really interesting card. I think a lot of people thought it would be broken looking at it, you know, not allowing their enemy Pokemon to evolve. But at the same time, we are only talking about Pokemon in the active spot where not much evolution happens. It does do decent damage, 80 damage. It is a stage 1, which is cool. And it also opens up strategies for decks where you don't want Aerodactyl early necessarily, because this does not count as a basic Pokemon, the old Amber. So I do think there are strategies built around Aerodactyl that could be really cool. I think the card itself is not crushing it. For me, I'm going to put Aerodactyl down in the C tier, the could work tier. I don't think it's absolutely awful, but I also don't think this one is really shaking up the game much at all. There's maybe an argument that it goes all the way down to our D tier, but the set hasn't been out long enough. I haven't seen enough people take like really good cracks at this card. That being said, I don't know. I really don't see it. Let's talk a little bit about some other fighting cards here. I'm going to pull them up. We're going to pull up Marowak. We're going to pull up Machamp. We'll pull up Golem. We're going to pull up from the new set. Where is the new Golem? We've got new Marshadow. So like a few interesting cards here that we can talk about. Let's talk about a lot of the new fighting stuff and some of the old fighting stuff in the deck. Marshadow. I think Marshadow is kind of sneaky good. It's a card that you can slot into a deck. Usually like you have 1 Marshadow in a deck, and it sets up a really interesting situation where your opponents can never feel comfortable KOing that active spot. Now, there are a lot of ways around this, like Water Shuriken, poison damage, etc. That doesn't count for Marshadow's revenge damage, but if they KO Marshadow and you bring it in, basically you have this Pokemon on your bench, 1 energy on it all the time, and it is just a threat for your opponent saying, hey, you KO me, I come right in and do 100 damage. And for a lot of Pokemon, that could be putting them either within KO range or KOing them right out of the gate there. So I would say this card feels maybe B tier relevant, kind of like very specific to certain decks, but actually we could do some, you know, kind of cool stuff with it. Let's take a look at the rest of the cards here. Marowak EX. Marowak EX is a weird one. I would put it kind of low on this tier list, probably in the C tier maybe. It does feel like a lot of things have sort of taken its place in different ways, but to be honest, I never see it. Truly, I never see this card. I'm moving it to the MIA section. I don't see it much in tournaments. It feels like maybe even Aerodactyl could take its spot, right? It's also a stage 1. It's also an EX. The damage is more consistent. Marowak could always, like, kind of like Celebi, you could flip really well and do some great damage, but in general, I do feel like this card's fallen off considerably. I would love to see some more players try to pick it up, especially with some of the grass decks underperforming. You don't need to worry about a weakness, but yeah, Marowak just feels like I have not seen this card at all since Mythical Island dropped. Let's talk about Machamp. Machamp I actually think is kind of a decent card. The nice thing about Machamp is Machop, Machoke, Machamp all attack kind of on that energy curve, right? 1, 2, 3. Mega Punch does 120 damage. I think the really nice thing about Machamp here is that it has 180 HP. And there are actually a few kind of like HP breakpoints right now because of Mew that I think are pretty relevant. So if you're a Pokemon that has more HP than your attack damage, you are safe, essentially, from Mew EX, and I think that makes you a valuable card. I don't know how much Machamp we're going to see. It still is a Stage 2. There is another Stage 2 in the fighting realm that you might just play every single time over it, but I don't think Machamp is awful. I'm going to put it in our C tier. Now we're going to talk about Old Golem and New Golem. So Old Golem, the cool thing about this card was it had 3 colorless energy needed, so you could actually play Golem into decks that didn't run fighting energy and just Brock it and get this thing powered. I think that's a cool strategy, and maybe we could see something come from that. New Golem, however, feels like it's just really, really powerful, as well as New Graveler, which I'll talk about here. So this is Old Graveler. Old Graveler, 100 HP, 3 energy to do 70 damage. And the big issue with this is 3 energy. If you take a look at New Graveler, which I think is kind of like should be in almost every single Golem deck, you are able to attack for 2 energy. So you can Geodude for 1 energy, you can Graveler for 2, and then once you Golem, you can Golem and Brock, essentially still on that energy curve at that point for 4 energy. New Golem, let's look at it. 160 HP with Guard Press, 120 damage, where you take minus 30 from your opponent's next attacks. So here's what's interesting about this is not only does it have a solid amount of HP, it's also not an EX Pokemon, right? So you're only losing 1 point if this Pokemon goes down. It's weak to grass. Grass has not been super relevant, but even if it wasn't weak to grass, it was weak to something else. 160 HP with minus 30 on the next attack. There's really only a couple things in the game that you are worried about. Charizard can still get you in 1, but besides that, most of the meta cannot KO this Pokemon. Mew cannot KO it. Mewtwo cannot KO it. Even if Mewtwo has Giovanni, still after you've attacked with Guard Press, it cannot KO this Pokemon. Gyarados can't take it down, so this creates a really interesting situation for a non-EX card to sort of feel like an EX card and feel pretty relevant. Right now, I'm going to move it up to the A tier. I might be a little excited about it just because it recently won a tournament, but I actually think there's some really cool strategies around this. And with Grass not feeling super relevant, and with this Pokemon not worrying too much about Mew, again, really the only one-shot in the game is going to be Charizard, or they bring in your Golem before you're ready for it, and they're still able to use Giovanni. Like, obviously they can't Sabrina Giovanni the same turn. So there are just so many situations where this card does not go down, and it's really hard once it gets online. Right now I'm going to move it to our A tier. I feel like it could be a really solid meta choice for fighting, which leaves Other Golem. I don't think Other Golem's terrible. I don't think D tier is necessarily talking about that card only, but when you're comparing the two, I feel like New Golem is a real superstar. However, again, Other Golem can make some really cool plays because it only requires 1 fighting energy, so you can put it in a deck that doesn't run fighting energy. There are other cool fighting cards to talk about. Like, I really like Mankey Primeape. I like kind of all versions of it. You could still make some Onyx decks and things like that. Sandslash, it's, you know, still a decent card. But as far as like the cards that you will see often sort of shuffled in and out of decks here, I think you're going to be looking at these fighting cards. Let's take a look at another type here. All right, let's talk about some of the new dark card additions. Scolipede, I think, is a big one here. It is a stage 2, and it operates a lot like Muck, but for 1 less energy and less retreat cost. So if your opponent is poisoned, you do 50 more damage with this attack. It's obviously dark type, so that's really nice into some of these psychic cards that you're seeing. Weak to fighting, and I feel like there are actually a few scrappy fighting decks that give it some trouble. But in general, I think Scolipede is looking pretty powerful, especially with something like Wheezing. I don't think it's amazing. I feel like it would hang here in the B tier, but it feels like a pretty relevant card for a lot of different dark decks. Now, as we're talking about dark, I don't think the new Wheezing is really it right now. I still think the old Wheezing is extremely good. This is like an A tier card for me, especially because I feel like you can slot Wheezing into so many decks. This just feels like a really meta card in a lot of different ways. Works well with Scolipede, but works well as a wall for lots of different Pokemon, especially because of its interaction with Koga. I think Wheezing is still a really, really great card. I put the Nidos in here mainly just to talk about how bad they are. I mean, Nidoking I get maybe is okay. Nidoqueen I think is terrible. These cards need something working with them for them to actually get any real value in the game, unfortunately. Cool cards, cool ideas. I just don't think they work well at all. And then we have Arbok. Arbok is a weird one. I think Arbok worked better when it felt like we were running into a ton of Mewtwo. I don't think it's terrible. I'm going to put it into our C tier here. I think in a weird way, there are some cards that have sort of, I feel like they've kind of taken its shine a little bit. I feel like the Scolipede deck just seems like more of what you're going to be running if you're trying to sort of even trap something to do poison damage, because you don't need to trap it when you can do enough damage for it to go down in 1, right? You can poison with Wheezing, Koga, bring Scolipede in for a big time KO. I think Arbok still could be used in some decent decks. It's not a bad card by any means, but I don't think it's super relevant in the meta right now. All right, talking about Psychic cards, there are a lot of new cool cards for Psychic decks, but we could start with the big bad, right? Mewtwo is still here, and I still think Mewtwo is very, very good. Mewtwo, for me, is bordering on S tier, but it's actually been getting kind of beaten out in some of the recent matchups, especially in tournaments. And I think there are a few reasons why, and I'll get into that here in 1 second. One of them being Mew EX. I think Mew, so it's really interesting. Mew feels like a really good card for some Psychic decks, but Mew can slot into a lot of different decks. And the nice thing about Mew is when you look at a Pokemon like Mewtwo, I talked a little bit about this earlier with Golem. Mewtwo has an attack that does 150 damage and it has 150 HP. This makes it a real problem when it's running into Mew. You see, Mew EX is a card that, yes, can take Psychic Energy, only has 130 HP, but because of its attack genome hacking, it can take something that your opponent is throwing at you, throw it back at them, possibly for less energy, but for the same amount of damage. I think to me, Mew actually feels like an S tier card, even though I don't know if we found a Mew deck that is necessarily the most S tier thing in the game. I actually think Mew as a card is helping define the meta in a massive way. So again, when you look at a card like Mewtwo, 150 damage, 150 HP. Mew is a one-hit KO against this unless they use blue, but then you can play Giovanni, right? So there are ways to play around it, but running into Mew is scary for Mewtwo. If you look at some other cards in the meta, like let's take a look at something like Charizard. Charizard right here. 180 HP, 200 damage. Again, very scary for Charizard running into something like Mew. There are a lot of cards where it's pretty scary. Then there's some other cards where it's not so scary. Something like Golem that we looked at earlier. Something like Gyarados, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Gyarados has 180 HP, but it has only 140 damage with its attack. So Gyarados will outperform Mew in sort of this situation that I'm presenting, right? Mew, however, I think is hurt Mewtwo more than I expected. Like more than a lot of other cards, I think Mewtwo was actually hurt by Mew. This doesn't mean that Mew decks are going to be the best, but I do think Mew is just defining the meta in such a big way because of how it plays into some of these super powerful cards. Let's talk about some other Psychic cards. Gengar. I'm sorry. I just don't. I don't think Gengar's it, guys. Gengar is stage 2, so it's a lot. It's only 100 damage. And I think Gengar is running into the exact same stuff that Mewtwo used to, excuse me, that Gyarados used to run into, the non-EX version of Gyarados, where you just go, man, for all the setup you have with this card, it just doesn't do enough damage. Yes, you can win some games with it. Of course, you could do some good damage, but you can't wipe enough Pokemon. Like, you can't one-hit KO enough Pokemon for this card to be super relevant, in my opinion. And its ability, while cool, is just only useful when you're in the active spot. So as soon as your opponents get rid of you, it's no longer relevant, right? It's not like Water Shuriken that you can use on the bench or Jungle Totem that empowers all of your cards. It's something that only matters when it's out there in the active spot. I would love to find some really good Gengar decks. I just don't think it works that well in this meta. This meta is too fast and it's too bursty. I just don't think Gengar plays that well into it. Gardevoir, on the other hand, is still one of the best cards in the game. Now, again, putting Gardevoir in our S tier, I think it deserves to be in the S tier as a card. Of course, there is no deck that is just simply a Gardevoir deck, but it powers up every Psychic deck in absurd ways. Mewtwo doesn't really exist without Guard, and I think Guard just should be mentioned as being one of the best powers in the game. Like, it's just a battery for your Psychic decks, and it's so incredibly good. Now, another card I wanted to talk about before we moved away from some of our Psychic decks is Slab. If you guys have been watching the stream, you know what I think about Slab. I think Slab is an insanely good card. Let me pull it up here. We've got to head down to some of our items. Slab, Mythical Slab, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about. Mythical Slab lets you look at the top card of your deck, and if that card is Psychic, you put it in your hand. If it's not, it goes to the bottom of your deck. When a deck like Mewtwo is so incredibly reliant on getting specific cards, I think this is a must run in some Mewtwo decks. I really do. Because the thing about Mewtwo is, if Gardevoir is online and you have two Mewtwo's, you can kind of switch between them, you're a really, like, nigh impossible deck to stop at that point, right? Ideally, your opponent would want to do some damage to you, put you in tough situations before you got to that place. If you use Mythical Slab correctly, you could use it, pull exactly what you need, and then build your deck. So let's say you use Slab, right? And you pull an X speed and you throw it to the bottom of the deck. That's a bummer, but if it gets you one turn closer to getting Kirlia so that you can get Guard, it really doesn't matter. Now, the times that Mythical Slab is rough, right, is when you play Slab and you get Professors. I think if you still have Professor's Research in your deck, the only time you can run Slab is if your deck is really thin and it doesn't matter, right? You need to pull Gardevoir or Kirlia at some point, and it doesn't matter what goes to the bottom. You just need that card or the next card to be them. Or you have a Pokeball still in your hand, so you can play Slab. If you accidentally bottom deck your Professors, you can use Pokeball, reshuffle your deck, and have an opportunity for that not to be at the bottom. That being said, I think Slab is an amazing addition to Psychic decks, and yeah, I'm kind of surprised Mewtwo's not doing better because of the addition of Slab, but I do think there are a few reasons why Mewtwo is like kind of knocked off its S tier perch right now. I'm not going to throw it up there in this video, but I should give a shout out to Budding Expeditioner as an amazing card with Mew. Mew is probably going to pair with this every single time. It's just played like a Koga for Mew, and it's just really, really powerful, right? So you can set up Mew to do some cool plays. You can use it as a tank. You can retreat for very little energy. You also can just throw it right back in your hand with Budding Expeditioner, which I think is a really, really good card for Psychic decks. It feels like not a lot has changed with Fire decks in this new update, right? Like, new Rapidash is pretty cool. I think Volcarona, maybe there's something you can do with it. I just think it costs a lot of energy right now. New Magmar is fun because it one-shots Celebi in a Blaine deck. But in general, the cards you're going to be looking at are Charizard, Moltres, Arcanine, stuff like that. So let's start talking about Char. Charizard, I actually think, is maybe doing a little better in this set, but also it has to watch out for Mew as a little bit of a counter. So there's some scary things with Char. One nice thing about Charizard is no matter what it's going up against, it still has the ability to one-shot them. And I think that is really powerful, especially in a meta where your opponents could be throwing a lot of different things at you with really high HP now. Gyarados being one of them, Golem being one of them. We still could see things like Executor. Of course, Mewtwo, you could be looking to one-shot. And with Mewtwo feeling a little less relevant, it does feel like having that big, heavy swing one-shot Pokemon feels a little more powerful. For me, I'm going to put it right in line with Mewtwo right here. I think both of them are very, very good cards. Both of them are kind of teetering on that S tier. No question, these are meta staples. I think they're both really solid. Moltres as well. I mean, it's hard to talk about Char and Arcanine without talking about Moltres. Arcanine is an interesting one here. So let's talk about it. Arcanine is a card that I think was doing really well because of what it was running into, which is a lot of Pikachus, right? Arcanine can KO Pikachu in one hit. Pikachu's doing well, but we also have some really tanky cards that Arcanine does not do well into. Again, Brock, the new Brock Golem, we have the new Gyarados, things like that are not super scared of Arcanine, and that puts it in a tough spot. It plays okay into Mew. Right now, I'm going to put it into our B tier here. I think there are still a lot of good fire decks that could be made with Arcanine, but I do think the bulkier opponents that it will run into put it in a scary position, right? Because they're going to need to hit it multiple times to do something, and it's always going to be in KO range of some of these big threats that we'll talk about here in a minute. Lightning decks are interesting. It feels like Lightning didn't get a lot, but it also feels like with the rise in popularity of certain water decks and certain things that just kind of want to wall you off and not let you attack, it does feel like Lightning is still extremely relevant, extremely powerful, and it's not as unreliable as some of these coin flip decks, right? Pikachu is just a super, super reliable deck. So let's start talking about some of the Lightning cards that you'll see. Pikachu seems to be doing pretty dang well into some of the new meta matchups, Pikachu EX specifically. In fact, I'm going to keep Pikachu up into our S tier right here. It's weird because it was having some trouble with Arcanine, but Arcanine's having a lot of trouble with some of these bulkier decks. Pikachu, on the other hand, especially paired with something like Zebstrika, which I'm not going to put into our S tier, but I'm going to set it next to Pikachu right here, just as an example. Zebstrika, able to snipe the bench, is really relevant. I think Hitmonlee is actually pretty relevant because of that too. You have so much of the meta right now revolving around like your opponent setting up a wall and then powering a really tanky bench. With Lightning Deck's ability to kind of counter that, not only with how fast they set up, how easy they retreat, and with their ability to snipe the bench, I think Pikachu is really relevant. I could put Pikachu, Raichu, Zebstrika kind of all up in this S tier. Pikachu, Raichu, and Pikachu Zebstrika decks have been performing really, really well into a lot of the new meta stuff. And it's weird because you didn't see a lot of Lightning get added, but what you did see get added is actually pretty solid for Pikachu to play into. And then we have Zapdos on its own. I mean, a decent card, but of course with the Lightning deck, pretty awesome. I'm going to set it in the B tier here. You can't really make a deck around Zap, but Zap slots in so well to tons of Lightning decks. It's a great wall with very low retreat costs. And then we have Dedenne. I'm just bringing it up here because I do think it's a fun addition to some of these decks. It's probably like C tier. However, it's a 50-50 that you're stalling your opponents for one energy. It's actually not bad, especially when you are desperately looking for certain cards in your deck. But I think it's probably, you know, just kind of like an off meta, like niche choice that you'll slot in one of them into your Lightning deck. It's not your main damage dealer or anything, but it's not too bad. Also, one cool thing is if you are running into some of these new water decks, you do get some extra damage, and as a Lightning Pokemon into Moltres, Articuno, stuff like that, you are doing the extra damage as well. I want to talk about the new addition of some normal Pokemon into the meta, one big one being Pidgeot EX. Now, tournament-wise, I really haven't seen much play for this card. It's a pretty interesting Pokemon. The damage is a little low just on its face, but with so much of the meta setting up the bench, I actually think this could be a really, really solid card. I just haven't seen much of it in tournaments. However, in the games I played with it, it's really fun. So it does 80 damage plus 20 for each benched Pokemon. This pairs well with Pokeflute. It's a very fun combination. It's kind of cheesy, but when it works out, it's really hilarious where you will bring back a KO'd Pokemon to your opponent's bench just so your Pidgeot EX can do more damage. I think that is a very fun combination. Also, solid amount of HP, and because it is a normal type, it is colorless, so you could slot it into a few different decks. I've seen it with Druddigon, Weezing. I played it with some Psychic cards like Sigilif and stuff like that, which I really enjoyed because it's easy to kind of get set up. I don't think this is crazy meta or anything. I'm going to move it into our B tier for now. This might actually start performing better as more players start to pick it up. But right now, I think it's a pretty solid card. Looking at some of the rest of our choices here, Chatot, I'm going to move up as well. Chatot's a really interesting card. In certain decks, people play this and have a lot of fun with it. Look, in Pocket, I think it's extremely important to notice it's not always the amount of cards you have in your hand as it is getting the cards you need, right? If you need a stage 2 to come online and you can't find a stage 1, Chatot could be an invaluable card. I'm going to put it into our C tier here. Again, these are not cards that are bad. These are cards that I think could work in a lot of decks, but I'm not seeing a ton of play with them. Tauros, I think, is a pretty solid card. Tauros is interesting. The thing that's tough about Tauros is those big horns. No, the thing that's tough about Tauros for me is the 3 energy requirement. It's nice. It's basic. It's able to do 120 damage to an EX Pokemon. It's colorless. You could put it in a lot of different decks. I've been trying to slot it in here or there, and I haven't found amazing decks for it, but I do think that it's a definite meta counter depending on what it's running into. I'm going to put it into our C tier. Again, these are not bad cards, but cards that I think could work in the right decks, and I'd like to see more from it. Wiggly's an interesting one. If we could talk about Wigglytuff EX for a second. I don't see it anymore. And maybe it's because it is right in line with getting KO'd by so many of the scary Pokemon right now, right? Like Mewtwo gets it in 1, Gyarados gets it in 1, Charizard gets everything in 1, and it's very close to getting taken out by other, meta cards right now. I just don't see much Wiggly. I'm going to put it in our MIA tier. I don't think it's bad, but I also just really have not seen much of it played. And maybe because of the walls that we're dealing with, it's just not having much fun into it, right? It needs to do 80 damage into something like Druddigon, and once it does that, it takes 20. Putting something to sleep that's not attacking isn't super relevant. So that's just kind of what's going on with Wiggly. I really don't see much Wiggly right now. All right, let's talk about our water types here because there are a lot of them and there's a lot going on with water Pokemon right now. We'll just start with Gyarados EX right off the bat. Gary is doing great. It's 180 HP. It's only a stage 1, so you don't have that really unfortunate part where you're digging through the deck for that card. You just can't seem to find the stage 1 to get to your stage 2. Rampaging Whirlpool also, like the energy, sometimes it discards some really key energy. If it discards it from you, you just put it back on at the start of your turn to attack. It's a really, really good card, especially with some of the walls that are out there. It's doing well in tournaments. It's doing well with a few different decks. I love that Gyarados is relevant. I'm putting Gyarados in our S tier here. One of the better cards in the game and one of the best cards in Mythical Island, it feels like. Of course, there are a lot of other cards that help set it up, which we'll talk about here. But yeah, I think Gary's crushing it. Another card I want to put really high on our tier list into our A tier is Greninja. So Greninja is obviously not a new card, but Greninja is just dang good, man. Water Shuriken is so good. 20 damage. Whether they're on the bench or in the active spot, it doesn't trigger lots of like it doesn't trigger a revenge effect on Marshadow. There are just so many good things about it. You can mess with your opponent's walls, or if your opponent is walling, you could just hit the things on the bench from your bench. I think Gren is a really good card, and you see it in so many different decks right now. I think Greninja is just crushing it. It's honestly kind of like an S tier card for me, but it feels like kind of specific to some water decks. Still, I think Gren is pretty dang amazing. And the nice thing is, even if you don't build any energy on it, you can do damage. So Gren is like, to me, it's up here in the A tier, and it kind of feels like the same conversation I'm having with something like Mewtwo almost, where it's like, I think Gren is just really great all the time, and it's really relevant in the meta right now. Let's talk about Blastoise. Interesting card. It really didn't have its day in the sun in Genetic Apex, and it so far has not had its day in the sun here in Mythical Island paired with Genetic Apex, right? I am going to leave it in MIA. I don't think it's bad. Like, let's talk about a few things about it. 180 HP. That's awesome. Hydro Bazooka, if you get 5 energy, you're doing 160. That is also pretty dang solid. You KO a lot of the roster with 160 water damage. So I think that's pretty good. Like, for instance, we talked about Golem a little earlier. Golem, Executor, lots of these things are going down. Mewtwo EX, like all of this stuff is going down to Blastoise. It is a stage 2. It does take a lot of energy. Maybe with Vaporeon, we actually could see sort of a similar setup to what people are using with Gyarados, or even just a similar setup with Druddigon, trying to power Blastoise. Again, strong card, I don't see it at all. So there's that. Now we have Articuno. I'm not sad to say I don't see much Articuno anymore. I think it's okay, but I think with so many other water options, like you could slot it into some decks. It is a good wall, and especially with something like Vaporeon able to pull the energy off of it, you could power it, use Leaf, get it back to your bench, Vaporeon somebody else. I don't think this card is irrelevant. I do think it's a relevant card, but I just don't see it as much as I used to, which, again, I'm not going to shed a tear for seeing less Articuno 18 trainer. Starmie. I think Starmie is still a really good card. I actually think Starmie is better with Vaporeon than it was before. With a 0 retreat cost, you can now use Starmie, and then when it's time to bring it back to your bench, you didn't waste any energy powering this thing up. It easily is transferred to your next Pokemon, probably something really powerful like Gyarados or Blastoise, or even onto Vaporeon, so Vaporeon can attack. I think Starmie is pretty strong, pretty relevant. I'm going to move it to our A tier. Really solid card in the water decks. We've been talking a little bit about it. Let's talk about Vaporeon. You know what? Let's talk about full art Vaporeon, because I have like 18. I have 10 of these. Full art Vaporeon. I think Vaporeon's great. It is a really solid addition to water decks. It feels instrumental in bringing certain things to life, and I think we have not even seen this card's full potential yet. I'm definitely moving it to the A tier. If it was part of the most relevant Gyarados deck right now, I'd probably move it S, even though there is like a Gyarados Starmie deck that I think is really solid. But yeah, Vaporeon's great. Awesome addition to the set. It just makes water so much more relevant, because one of the issues water decks have had for the longest time is they are really energy hungry, probably because of how Misty plays in the game, right? So they've made all these cards super energy hungry, but then after you've set them up, you can't set up another card in time. Well, now using something like Vaporeon, Leaf, or even X speeds, you're able to bring something back and power another water Pokemon, and Vaporeon allows that. I think it's a great card, so it's going to go to our A tier. And then we have Lapras EX. I was trying to look back at it. I don't think I've seen a single Lapras EX, not one, since Mythical Island's come out. And I know this is just me. These are just like this is my experience with playing. I haven't seen any Lapras EX. Its HP is not super high. It's only 140. It only does 80 damage, 4/3 energy. Maybe you could pair this around with Vaporeon and get some value out of it. But unfortunately, I feel like Lapras is just not... I truly haven't seen it once. I don't think I've seen any information on it in tournaments either. I think Lapras is just completely missing right now. Let's talk briefly about steel types. Obviously, I'm very surprised that Melmetal did not get any, not even Melmetal, but just any steel type didn't get anything in Mythical Island. To me, I'm guessing, and this is purely a guess, I have no information saying this, but I would guess our next big set for Pokemon Pocket is going to focus around Johto. Like, this one wasn't all Kanto, but it was mostly Kanto stuff, right? I'm guessing the next big set is mostly Johto, where we could see Steelix, Scizor, Skarmory, stuff like that, and really make metal decks relevant. But right now, I'm just not seeing it. I never see it, and I don't think it's very good. So whichever tier you want to put it in, if MIA makes you feel a little bit better, but I just think metal, unfortunately, doesn't have much of a place in this meta. Metal is not meta. We'll be right back. Next, I want to talk about dragon types. We only got one new dragon type. We have Dragonite in the game currently. I think Dragonite is just wildly inconsistent. It's like, if you think Celebi is inconsistent, get ready to start playing some Dragonite decks. Really fun card, but just so many ways that it can go wrong that unfortunately I don't think it's very relevant in the meta. I'm going to put it into our D tier. It's cool when you get it online. If you can get a couple Draco Meteors out, you can win. Don't get me wrong, but it's just so inconsistent that play it if you like it, but also just know that you're going to have matches that you couldn't win no matter what you do. If you haven't seen it, there's a video where I get like water energy 10 turns in a row. So it is what it is sometimes with these decks. Next, we have Druddigon. So Druddigon is interesting in that on its face, you go, okay, Dragon Claw, that's 3 energy, 2 of them being different types, right? 2 retreat cost, 100 HP. okay. That seems okay. It's not okay. It's one of the best cards in the game, it feels like right now. Or at least, let me word it like this. Without saying the word best, it's at least one of the most relevant meta cards in the game, being the wall for almost every deck out there. 100 HP, no weaknesses, 2 retreat costs, which we'll talk about here in a bit, is not bad at all. You are not attacking with this. In fact, you're just punishing your opponents if they want to attack you, putting a lot of your Pokemon in KO range of whatever you're powering up on the bench, right? So let's say you're powering up Gyarados on the bench. If the enemy Mewtwo attacks you at all, it is now in KO range of your Gyarados. And you could, this could be said about many, many cards, right? It puts so many cards in KO range of your like big one-hit knockout enemies Pokemon that you see it with Pidgeot and Gyarados, and I've seen it with like tons of decks here as I'm looking through. You see it with Golem. You see it with different fighting decks. You see it with, you could just put it with so many different decks because it's a good wall. It only costs you 1. It's not an EX. It's actually retreatable, which we'll talk about here in a sec. And again, it puts your opponents in KO range if they dare to attack you. It's pretty dang solid, and it is one of the most relevant cards in the meta right now. Another card I want to talk about, we're not going to talk about all the supporters and things like that. I've had other videos talking about them. I want to talk about Leaf. Leaf, I think, is an insanely relevant card. I think Leaf is S tier, crazy important. You are able to use a Leaf and retreat a Pokemon for 2 less. There are so many plays that can be made now because of Leaf. So many Pokemon that you are not, sacrificing all the energy they had attached to them. So many switch-ins that you can do. Like when you're powering Gary and you're ready to pull Druddigon out, Leaf, Gyarados comes right in and can start swinging. This is true of so many Pokemon. I think Leaf is one of the most meta-shaking cards in all of Mythical Island, this supporter. And there's some other cards you could definitely talk about, but Leaf feels like way up there. So for me, as I take a look at our tier list here, I try to think, what is our God tier here? What is the one card that I feel like is the biggest card? And it's tough because every card requires something attached to it, right? Like Mewtwo isn't as relevant without Gardevoir, and so on and so on and so on. But I have to give it up. It's one of 2 cards for me, and it's not Gyarados. It's either Drud or it's Leaf. And I gotta say, I think with how every deck right now is being built around Druddigon, our God tier card of Mythical Island is the unlikely addition of the only dragon type that they added. Hey, where'd you go, buddy? The only dragon type that they added to this collection. I really do think this is such a meta shaker. Now, if you want to say Gary should be here, Leaf should be here, maybe even like Mew or something should be here, Mythical Slab should be here, I can't argue with you, but I do have to say I feel like this card is changing Pokemon Pocket in massive ways. It's just every deck is set up around this thing. And because of that, you're going to see so many counter decks come out that are going to be dealing with your opponents in different ways. And I'm really excited for it. Let me know what you think in the comments. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Did you like this format where I kind of go a little more in depth on some of the cards? Let me know. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for listening. As always, the meta will change, but you never will. You're a constant, baby. All right. I love you. I'll see you next time. We did it. Mythical Slab for life.